I think I'm in favour of all nukes, actually. I don't have a favourite. I think once they're built and they're operating, you're never going to regret it, right? They're just so reliable and they're so useful in what they produce, because they don't just produce power at huge volumes, they produce heat. And increasingly, when we get through this decarbonisation journey, we're going to have to deal with heat, and heat isn't easy. Because they've maxed everything out to the absolute max, they couldn't shave off the impurities, so they rolled it anyway. And then famously, the inspectors came around and went, hang on a sec, the impurity level in this casing is slightly higher. Why is that? And they went, oh, well, we didn't do the normal shaving. It doesn't materially affect the steel. But in the world of nuclear, everything is micromanaged to within an inch of its life. And that failure to take into account the fact that you need to take out the impurities by cutting the steel meant they had to start again. I mean, can you imagine having to then do that whole industrial process one more time? Of course it adds costs. It's completely ludicrous.
Welcome to Saving the World from Bad Ideas. I'm Mark Lynas, and I've had a few bad ideas in my time. I used to go out in the nighttime to destroy GMO crops, and I also opposed nuclear power. But then when I looked at the science, I found I got it wrong. Oops! I've learned the hard way that none of us are right all the time. So now I'm here to challenge the assumptions that we all too often take for granted, because the future depends on us getting it right. My guest today is Bryony Worthington, aka the Baroness Worthington of... Bryony, where are you Baroness of again?
Well, Cambridge, but I don't use that because there's only been one Worthington, so I'm the Baroness Worthington. So you don't need the of bit.
Oh, I don't need... Oh, okay. I was thinking there was some town in England they were building a statue of you, but that's good. Not. Yeah, well, they might do one day, because you're the originator of the UK's Climate Act, which came about from a campaign that you worked on at Friends of the Earth when you were there, and then later when you worked for the government. And you're now, even more famously, co-host with Michael Liebreich, who we've had on as a guest here, of the Cleaning Up podcast. So welcome to Saving the World from Bad Ideas.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, delight to be with you.
Well, it's even more of a delight to have you. And now it's safe to say that you're a long-time enthusiast for nuclear power. And I thought, since this is the season finale, we could go all in on nuclear and contest the bad idea that nuclear is not relevant, it's too expensive, it's not going to happen, the future is going to be all renewables. So if I be the kind of devil's advocate of that side, you've got an hour to convince me that nuclear is still in the game and still important. So are you up for that?
Yeah, definitely. Yep.
And maybe I'll start with the renewables revolution, which is something that Ember, which is a think tank that you co-founded, they're calling the electro-tech revolution, which is a phrase I rather like. Solar and batteries are now growing so fast that, it's pretty much exponential globally. They're on the sort of steep upward part of the S-curve. And I just looked at the latest stats, and solar I think it's grown by... It's been doubling every 3 years. It's the fastest growing electricity source in history. So when the Paris Agreement was signed back in 2015, it was 1% of global electricity. And now in the first half of 2025, it's getting up to about 9%, 8.8% at the last count. And, that's only one part of the story. Perhaps just as significant is that batteries are now taking off too, which combined with solar makes almost, solar plus batteries as baseload, just like nuclear famously is. And Ember calls batteries silos for sunshine, which is rather lovely. The latest figures show 160 gigawatt hours of new battery storage last year, and prices have fallen tenfold over the last 7 years. So I'm beginning to sound a bit breathless with all of this, but are you on board with the electro-tech revolution? Do you think it's all as significant as it sounds?
Firstly, I should say I completely love what's happened in the kind of take up of clean electricity. It is kind of breathtaking to watch. And Ember, I've had a sort of front seat in terms of watching that data come through and the narratives emerge. I'm not in any way seeking to sort of suggest that this is going to be slowed down or wanting it to slow down, but S-curves have a habit of having, the top part of the S-curve is when it flattens. And famously, the IEA was always predicting there'd be steep increase and then the flattening off, and they got it all wrong. But it's not without potential to slow down. And the reason I say that is because if you look into the data, this is what Ember does, a large part of this story tracks back to China and the extraordinary pace at which China's been installing wind and solar, which has meant that it's now caught up and overtaken other sources of electricity provision. But it is a China story. And if China runs out of room, metaphorical room for renewables, or decides for other reasons to slow down, then you could see that S start to flatten faster than you would want. Now, China's also exporting solar panels and batteries to the rest of the world, but there is no bigger market than China's own internal market. And they also have the speed with which to move that other countries really don't have. So, yeah, it's very much a China story. And what keeps me focused on other sources of technologies, because China's not just doing wind, solar, and batteries. It's also doing nuclear. It's also doing geothermal. It's also doing, you name it, it's doing it. And that's what makes me kind of feel like if you understand China's energy demand needs, and it's not just about electricity, it's also about heat, then you end up looking at nuclear again, thinking, yeah, actually, there is a really important role for it to play here. Your question was, do I think that the electrotech is as exciting as it seems to be? And the answer to that is yes. I'm just a little bit perhaps sanguine about the breathlessness of this. All we need is these three technologies. I don't really subscribe to that.
You've just been to China, so we'll come back to that and talk in more detail about that, because that really is the center of this massive electrotech revolution. But the issue seems to be cost curves, right? Solar, wind, and batteries, they've come down, and that's due to modularity and learning. And your co-host Michael Liebreich always waxes lyrical about this. But staying with the big picture here, no one's seeing downward cost curves for nuclear, are they? Because I guess because they're not actually getting built anywhere.
Well, I mean, they are getting built places, and they were built in places, right? So I suppose just to tell the story of nuclear, then, it was a technology that was originally developed for weapons. We all know that, but it was quickly also understood that it could be commercialized for generating electricity. And the famous phrase of, too cheap to meter. And there was this kind of period of rapid development, particularly driven by the US and by the UK and Europe, but also latterly, now importantly, being picked up by Asia and China. But the story of how it was done, got dominated by the choice of technology. And we chose the pressurized water reactor because that's where it originated out from, the sort of defense and manufacturing of weapons. And the PWR, hasn't shown itself to be very effective at coming down the cost curve. The French famously built out a huge number of them in a very rapid space of time. This is in the 80s during the oil shock period, where just to get off a dependency on oil, France decided to go nuclear. And the Mesmer plan saw a huge build out of nuclear in a very rapid space of time. So we got to quite a high level of global electricity production through this quite intense phase of build. And you're absolutely right. The S-curves didn't show themselves to be as amenable to coming down as solar and wind, because they're much more modular. But there was this period where we didn't stop building. We built one, we carried on. We had this learning phase. And the French did prove that it could be done in relatively fast. But then it stood the test of time. The thing about nuclear is, once you've built it, it becomes infrastructure, really. And it's there in the background, producing heat and power reliably for up to 80 to 90 years, potentially. So we're starting to see, some of these plants are coming off now because they were built in the 60s and 70s, but we've still got a big number operating around the world and producing not a small amount of electricity. For the longest time, hydro was the biggest source of clean electricity, followed by nuclear. And then the rest of renewables were just trailing, nowhere to be seen on the graph. Now, if you combine wind and solar, they're coming up, and they produce more electrons, more terawatt hours than nuclear does. But we forget that nuclear is just there in the background since that period, providing us with reliable electricity. And over time, of course, it's relatively cheap, because if you amortize those capital costs over 80 years per unit today, that's not that expensive. The problem is you've got the big high capital costs up front that skews the investment case, and that is not an insignificant issue. So I'm not saying there are no problems, but I think we sometimes treat nuclear a bit unfairly. We equate it all with the French project that's famously 20 years over delayed and massively over budget. But that was a technology choice, and it was a particular build, and we should look at it more in the round of the history of nuclear, which, if we hadn't had nuclear, we'd have had a lot dirtier air, we have a lot less clean electrons, we have a lot more fossil fuels that were burnt. So I'm glad that we did that phase. And I think we're entering a new phase now where nuclear is being done differently.
Nicely put. And I agree about the past. And also, I'm sure we agree that early shutdowns of nuclear make no sense at all. I guess the question I've still got is whether there will be any more PWRs built, these pressurized water reactors you were talking about. I had, as a guest on this show, Julia Pike from Sizewell C, And I think the numbers was like £38 billion for Sizewell C. And I think that's just the overnight cost, like just the construction cost. And if you add in financing, it's pushing like 100, if you believe the Financial Times. I mean, you're not going to get many of many more of those things built at that kind of cost, at least not to the extent that we need clean energy for the future to decarbonize the whole energy system.
Yeah, no, there's a whole debate to be had. I'm sure you had it with Julia about the PWR in Britain story. Let's probably not rehearse it here again, because I think that is just one lens. And if you sit in London or you sit in Brussels, maybe that's the only thing you see. But if you look a little bit broader, you see that Korea is building nuclear reactors for the Middle East, or you see that Brazil has got a reactor where they actually forged the vessel for that in Sheffield. It was a Sheffield steel manufactured. There are projects going on. China, as we mentioned, is building one of everything and is testing out which one it thinks it can scale right now. And it's the one that's driving nuclear up still, whereas other parts of the world are shutting them down. So it seems like it's static, and it seems like it's got some very high profile problems. But I think that's a simplification of where we are. And we can come on to talk about this sort of now proliferation of different types of nuclear, which I think opens up some elements of modularity. I'm not saying it's ever going to be as quick as a silicon solar wafer in terms of its ability to innovate and come down the cost curve, but it certainly can't get any worse, right? So if you do modular and build more of them, then we will get cost learnings.
You can't get any worse. You heard it here first. I mean, that's the best argument.
No, you can't get any worse. Can't get any worse than Flamanville, I think is fair to say. I think the history of nuclear is the one that you peg yourself as not wanting to copy, basically.
For those that don't know, Flamanville is the EPR, the European pressurized reactor that they were building in France. I don't even know. I think it's up and running now, or maybe they've already had some issues. But there is one up and running at Olkiluoto in Finland, which I've actually been to. And I think they built some in China as well. And in China, they're also building, is it called the Hualong 1? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's a big, it's still building the big 1 gigawatt pressurized water reactors. So they seem to be able to do it. And you're in China. Do you know anything about their cost curves and what their latest thinking is on that?
Super hard, right, to get cost data out of China. The per megawatt hour price curves, costs that they're quoting, I really wouldn't know. I don't know them, so sorry. I'm much more interested in the politics of this and the narrative as well that we tell ourselves about success. And I think it's very easy to cherry pick really bad examples and say that was terrible. I mean, fundamentally, the EPRs got massive, right? There was this period where economies of scale ruled. So the bigger you build the reactor, the more units you get out, the more you can pay back. And I just think somehow the engineers was sort of pushed to one side and the economists got hold of it and they maxed it out to the absolute max. So these things that you visited one, they're like cathedrals in their scale. If you see a normal EPR, I think each turbine is 0.800 megawatts per turbine, and they add 2 together to get 1.6. They doubled it. So you now have 1.6 per turbine times 2 equals 3.2 gig. And that's an insane undertaking, really. It's like maxing out the engineering to its very, very limits. And what we saw with Flamanville was, just simple stuff like when they rolled out the steel, when the steel was cast, you're supposed to roll and then you take off the edges of the steel roll because that's where the impurities gather. But because they'd maxed everything out to the absolute max, they couldn't shave off the impurities. So they rolled it anyway. And then famously, the inspectors came around and went, hang on a sec, the impurity level in this casing is slightly higher. Why is that? And they went, oh, well, we didn't do the normal shaving. It doesn't materially affect the steel. But in the world of nuclear, everything is micromanaged to within an inch of its life. And that failure to take into account the fact that you need to take out the impurities by cutting the steel meant they had to start again. I mean, can you imagine having to then do that whole industrial process one more time? Of course it adds costs. It's completely ludicrous. I just think these big projects are just a bit, probably, it's too much hubris, and we perhaps need to stick to what we knew, which was the 0.8 megawatt, the 0.8 gigawatts units. We'd built a number of them. They worked. Why did we not just keep doing that?
Well, I mean, these enormous projects, it's like the opposite of modular, right? And
yeah.
So the world is pushing towards, in the nuclear renaissance, which is being hyped a lot, small modular reactors, SMRs. So the M is modular. Is that something you see as being the next big thing, or is it just another hype cycle?
I don't know. I mean, I think I'm in favour of all nukes. Actually, I don't have a favourite. I think once they're built and they're operating, you're never going to regret it. Right? They're just so reliable and they're so useful in what they produce, because they don't just produce power at huge volumes; they produce heat. And increasingly, when we get through this decarbonisation journey, we're going to have to deal with heat, and heat isn't easy. It's something that solar and wind and batteries don't really lend themselves to from just a pure kind of energy conversion basis. And if you've got something that's producing large amounts of heat, that's going to also be an asset. So I think the 500 megawatt is fine. Like, I don't think we need to go down to micro mini nukes in everyone's backyard. I don't think that will lend itself to economies of scale. And I don't know what's wrong with the 500 megawatt size, because that's the one that fits in where the coal units currently operate and where the gas units currently operate. So if you're thinking about systems change, if the thing you're replacing is as similar as the thing, if you can match what you're replacing, that's probably a good benchmark. But I mean, but then if someone wants to build hundreds of little ones, stack them all up, and that makes sense economically, I don't have an in principle objection to it. I don't think it's the savior. I think the core of nuclear is just the physics of it, right? That you've got the nuclear bond. It's so energy dense. It contains so much energy that when you split that atom, you release an enormous amount of energy in a very small space. And that's the gift. And I think exactly how we configure it and exactly how we commercialize it, I'm really open to someone making the case for any scale beyond the sort of, so that we're going to be using them to power our laptops. But even there, nuclear batteries is another really curious bit of modernity that we skip over. Why is the Mars rover happily roaming around taking pictures? It's running on a nuclear battery. That's not a fission battery, it's just a nuclear decay. So it's a naturally decaying element that keeps a tiny little wattage running for a long, long time. But that's super useful if you're running a mobile unit on a foreign planet. So nuclear is just exciting, therefore I can't imagine when we won't be exploiting it.
Nuclear for Mars, maybe not so much for Earth. We'll have to see. If you don't have a favorite SMR, I mean, there's so many dozens of competing projects out there. Like, and some, Oklo, which is probably one of the better known ones. I mean, their share price has gone through the roof. They're pretty close to, I think, to Chris Wright, the current energy secretary, right?
Close, he's on the board, isn't he? I think. And in this world, so. Conflicts of interest are no longer a problem. So, of course, he's still on the board.
Not for Trump, no. And I think Sam Altman was, who's the CEO of OpenAI, was also one of the early investors in that. So, you're in the US at the moment. Give us the kind of the American story, because it's like there seems to be a bipartisan consensus. It certainly isn't on climate change, and there certainly isn't on on renewables, which the Trump administration is trying to stop and block as fast as possible. But they are very pro-nuclear. Maybe no one's told them that it's low carbon. Do you think is that like a bipartisan way through the current impasse?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's complete agreement that, and because this is a country with a lot of nukes, right? As I was saying, in the 70s and 80s, right the way up to the 90s, they were building, and so there are lots of people who operate them, and they operate them brilliantly. And so there's no German equivalent of like, we must shut all our nuclear down for political reasons. It just doesn't exist here. And so, yes, the building dried up mainly because of the big discovery of shale gas and the cheapness of fossil, really, that kept them from building more. There just wasn't, the economics didn't make sense for them. But now that geopolitics has changed, all fossils run out at some point, right? Especially the shale gas, actually. There'll come a point where it's no longer growing in terms of its capacity. It'll start to shrink. So what do you do then? Where does your energy independence come from? And yes, they're building solar and wind, and Texas famously is the home of all of these things. But the realization is that nuclear is such a strategically important source of, once you've built it and once you've got your fuel supply chains in place, indigenous, independent energy source, then there's no way they're not going to do it. And then, so yes, there are lots of new actors coming into the place. I mean, you've still got big people like GE, GE Vernova, who are the big old industrial builders of note, these engineering companies. They've got their own reactor that they're building now. They're building the first one in Canada. Second one will be in the US. I think that's a 300 megawatt could call it an SMR, but it's still 300 megawatts, decent size. You mentioned Oklo. I don't know how much of that is nice marketing and the reality of that reactor project. I'm not really across it. You've got Kairos based here in California. A lot of smart money says that Kairos is a really sensible and strong endeavor. They're doing their first build now in, I think it's in Tennessee, or no, it's at the site of one of the big nuclear labs in the Midwest. And then you've got Bill Gates, of course. He's got his own version as well. The TerraPower. Is it TerraPower? I get confused.
Yeah, I think it either is or was, but yeah, they're actually starting to build, aren't they, on that?
The Gates story is interesting because he put his smartest people on it, and they kind of went through a whole bunch of different nuclear designs. They settled on a kind of traveling wave reactor, which I don't know whether how much this was human intelligence or augmented intelligence, but anyway, the computer said this is the one to do, and then it actually hit the reality of politics and regulation, and it couldn't be progressed. And then, of course, he was going to try and do it in China, and it couldn't be done there either. It's just very, very hard to get it through regulatory approval. So he went back to the drawing board, went through another bunch of designs, and came up with the Natrium reactor. And that's now, yes, getting built in Wyoming, importantly in Wyoming, where it's an old coal mining state, lots and lots of blue collar jobs and a kind of pride in coal and energy. And that was symbolically chosen to sort of make this new form of energy kind of politically relevant there. Yeah. So US, there's stuff is being built, but it's being built quite small, quite slow. Meanwhile, China's just throwing them up very fast all over the place in all types of different designs. So yeah, it'll be interesting. And then, of course, because it's the US, the fact that China's doing it is also part of the narrative, right? If we can't allow China to dominate the nuclear business, we have to get back in the game.
Well, not given that China dominates pretty much every other business now. All of the critical minerals, all of the batteries, increasingly more of the electric vehicles, solar, of course, wind, and so in terms of the new energy economy, it's all about China at the moment, and the US seems to be not just being left behind, but literally exiting the game and leaving the field open for the Chinese. And maybe nuclear is the one space that the United States still is interested in having an industrial policy to occupy. But I'm not so sure. It seems like it's going to be a long way off before any of these projects actually generate. I mean, at least a minimum of 10 years, probably 15. Do you think? Or am I being pessimistic?
Yeah, if you're just waiting for the terawatt hours to start to flow, yeah, it's going to take time for them to do the test reactors, and then they'll do the first commercial reactors, and then they'll scale from there. But as we said in the MESMA plan, once you've got a reactor that works and you decide to back it, and you just roll through, you can do a lot in a decade. And that's sort of the right timing, right? We've got a decade of wind and solar and batteries. Will take us through definitely to 2030, and by 2035, I think the nuclear phase build will start to pick up then. If that's one scenario, and I think it's a credible scenario, but it's not today's solution for sure.
But another scenario is that the wind, solar, and batteries can do it by themselves. I mean, particularly, I think the issue there is batteries, right? If batteries come down enough in price and to be scaled up sufficiently that you can literally just dump solar into them and they can run pretty much as baseload 24/7, even with some seasonal storage, then it's over for nuclear, right? I mean, if that's, it depends on the costs, but I think that's also a plausible scenario, don't you?
Well, I think you can do a huge amount, yeah, for sure. And let's just do it, right? The costs are there. Let's get all the impediments out of the way. Let's go, build. I think that is very likely to happen for the rest of this decade. I'm excited about it. Can it do everything? Well, no, not really, because certain things that the grid needs to move electrons, and I should say, it's not just batteries though, it's transmission as well, right? So you can store it or you can move it. Those are the two things. Or you can shed demand. But, there's going to be a lot of that happening to accommodate this new type of intermittent power. And that's all hugely exciting. But the reality is that we need a lot of heat, right? So, and this perhaps takes us back to China again. When I was working with this other project called Repower Initiative, we started in Poland, because if you look at Poland's use of coal, it's very different to the UK's use of coal. It was providing a lot of CHP services, a lot of heat. So you couldn't just say, oh, it's fine, just, switch to wind, it'll be fine.
CHP is combined heat and power. So that's like steam pipes going through the roads into people's houses and keeping the whole city warm, right? So you need a heat source for that.
Or it's powering an industrial process or a manufacturing process, or, all sorts of stuff like that, which we normally use gas for, but they were using coal. So there was this coal dependency, which wasn't just power. And so we started looking there about the role of nuclear, and actually Poland did stand up for nuclear in Europe and stood up to the Germans and the Austrians and insisted that they wanted to do this. And then partly the reason was they could see that Europe was becoming far too dependent on gas, right? That is the reality of when you're muddling through this transition with renewables, you need something to back up the renewables. Yes, you could try and build hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of batteries, and we are doing that now, but initially it was just gas that was providing the backup. So the Poles said, well, we're not so comfortable with that kind of combination. What if we do nuclear as well? So that's why Poland is going for nuclear. And Poland's conditions are quite similar to China's, just China is a vastly bigger space and a bigger challenge. So I think something like 60% of Chinese coal has a heat component that's used. So you can't just say, wind solar batteries. It's not going to answer that problem.
I think in Finland, they've got a SMR company that is designing small reactors specifically to provide heat at the municipal scale as well. So that's their solution, which I imagine they're hoping to export as well. But to come back to China, then tell us, well, if it's not private, tell us what you were doing there, and give us some kind of impressions of what the sort of energy landscape is there.
Yeah, I was over there for a few days for a meeting talking about this concept of how do you repower or kind of reuse your thermal assets and the infrastructure that's built up around your thermal assets, meaning your coal plant, and switch them out to clean. It's slightly different. It's a kind of subtle difference between just build your wind and solar anywhere and then interconnect them to the grid and it'll all be fine. It's kind of looking at these assets as what are they providing currently, the full services that they provide, and how do you switch them out. And it is facilitated by there being clean, large-scale clean sources of heat. So a nuclear reactor gives you that heat. It's that steam temperature. And the Chinese have developed a high-temperature reactor. So we talked about PWRs. I mean, they're quite low-grade heat, 300, 400 degrees of heat. That's not enough to power a coal turbine, really speaking. So there are versions of nuclear that produce much more high-temperature heat that can catch the exact steam that a coal turbine is running on. So that was exciting that China's already built and is already operating their first HTR, the high-temperature reactor. So that's one reason why this concept of switching the coal out for nuclear works in China. It's not just that, though. You can also use concentrated solar power. That's a source of heat, and it lends itself to that. Vast areas where you can put in CSP. And then you've got the advanced geothermal now, where you can drill for heat anywhere because of the advances in drilling technologies. So that's another potential technology that's going to come in and provide us with these heat sources. So that's why I was there. I was just exploring all of that. And as is always the case with China, you go there, and as we were prepping for going there, we just realized that pretty much everything we were going to say to them, they've already done, but they've just done it once, or they've done it in one area, or they've done an experiment pilot. They haven't codified it yet into a policy, or really done, not that we're aware of yet, that the scenarios they're looking at to get to their very challenging net zero targets haven't quite got this concept in there, embedded in there, of this reuse. So that's what we're excited about, is if we run the scenarios again with this idea embedded, what does that do in terms of China's ability to do this affordably and reliably and securely, basically.
Doesn't China already have a thorium reactor, molten salt thing, which has reached criticality? And I mean, did you get any intel on that?
So perhaps we should have started with the story of how I got interested in nuclear, because that was,
you were
that
thorium
was it.
pro or cis. I don't know what the
yeah, exactly. I was like a thoriophile, whatever the word is. I'd come across Kirk Sorensen while I was, I did a piece of work for The Guardian, actually, which was assessing world-changing ideas that could beat climate change. And they selected the best 10, and they brought them all to Manchester and got them presenting. And to credit to them, they selected a nuclear project, and it was Kirk's. And it was this idea that we could use thorium fuel as opposed to uranium, and we could combine that into a molten salt cooled reactor rather than a water cooled reactor, which is what the traditional ones are. And the combination of the fuel and the different coolant would give you a really inherently safe and different reactor. And it had been trialed famously by Alvin Weinberg in the 60s, and this was a revival of that idea. So I thought that was fascinating. That there was a whole type of nuclear that I'd never heard of, and it had all these different attributes, and that meant that it was no risk of a Chernobyl-style reaction happening if you switched to the molten salts. So it's a kind of an intriguing.
I think thorium was kind of a gateway drug for quite a few people. Yeah. So I mean, it seemed to me a bit of a. I don't want to knock you down, but a bit of a cult. People got so enthusiastic. Well, people got so enthusiastic about it, and the advantages to me didn't seem that significant over uranium. I mean, I know there's like tens of thousands of years worth of thorium just lying around, but anyway, back to China. They've actually got one up and running. I read it somewhere. Did you hear any more about this and whether it's even true?
Well, so it's the molten salts that they're testing, and they're doing it. I think it's in the Gobi Desert, and it's run out of Shanghai. There's a Shanghai University Institute devoted to this. And they're not using thorium with it. They're using just uranium fuels to test the molten salts as the coolant. And that's what's currently being built. And I believe is gone critical and is operating. I did not get to visit it. It's in the middle of nowhere. And China's like any vast continent scale country where information flows and slightly pocketed. So I was hanging out with the Tsinghua University people who are much more interested in the high temperature reactor, and that's what they're following. So but yes, they have got that, and we've also got their first little SMR that's coming on board quite soon. There's nothing they haven't really thought of or aren't doing. So that's their nature. What I found striking was in Europe, or in perhaps even in the US, we'll run ahead with an idea and we'll set targets and goals that we're not quite sure how we're going to meet, but we set them anyway because the challenge of getting there is going to be the thing, right? We do this not because it's easy, but because it's hard kind of thing. China's completely opposite. They'll only set a target if they're very, very confident they can exceed it. And they want to know in minute detail how it's actually going to work. So that's the cultural difference, I think, is that they're in their testing phase right now. They haven't announced, although their nuclear ambitions are vast compared to everyone else, it's still not, they're not at full speed. They're still testing, is my impression.
And of course, famously in the West, we can't actually build anything or anything large at cost, right? Whether it's a bridge or a high-speed rail or anything. Whereas in China, they don't seem to have that problem. I mean, maybe the big nuclear problems with big nuclear in the West are basically just an extension of that.
Oh well, there's no doubt the big construction they've got. Very good at it, and labor costs are different, land costs are different, the regulatory environment is different, land purchasing, cost of capital, etc., etc. All of that gives them an edge. I mean, yeah, just look at the high-speed rail, right? Here I am in California. How long have we been talking about putting high-speed rail between the two biggest conurbations on the West Coast? And it's still inching forward. They've built thousands of kilometers. They've connected all of their conurbations now with an amazing network. And it's happened practically overnight if you consider it in Western standards. So, yeah, there's definitely something about our inability to do infrastructure well. And I mean, this is a big topic, right? Because part of what's interesting in the US is you think of the US as this kind of like Wild West deregulated environment, but certain states like California, almost more regulated than Europe, right? If you want a nanny state, I love it here, it's amazing, but boy, do they like to choose and get involved and dictate, and their lawmaking process is kind of almost too easy. They can pass laws and spend money, but it doesn't require them to take a really long-term view. And there's a lot of hitching of agendas onto everything, right? If you're going to build a rail system, you better make sure that it ticks all the boxes of social justice and this, that, and the other. And I don't want to sound like I'm anti all of those things, but when you load it all onto infrastructure, gosh, does it slow it down.
And just finishing in China, are they planning to dominate on SMRs as well? Because, their kind of domination of solar and batteries and EVs and critical minerals hasn't come about by accident, right? That's been a project of industrial policies stretching back, 10 years or more. Do they have the same agenda and the same ambition when it comes to nuclear?
Almost certainly, yes. I mean, and I just saw a news article said that they're already trialing that they're going to have nuclear ships, right? So, you've got to remember that lots of driving factors. One, they have no oil and gas, right? So they cannot just sit back and use their own fuel or develop a fossil-based economy. They've got a load of coal, yes, but when it comes to transport particularly, they're very vulnerable. They're importing all of that oil. So of course they're going to push into everything that they can that makes it more secure, more domestic, build out the supply chains. So yeah, I think of course they'll do that. The other thing that's driving them is Tsinghua University has 100,000 people on that campus, and they produce so many engineers, and so many people are working really, really hard. Like the level of dedication to furthering yourself through education is incredible. Those people all got to find jobs in the economy. And the real kind of worry is that, we're going to have unemployment or unrest, or people working all their lives to get their kids into the best university to do really well, and then no job. So they build out industries as an extension of that drive towards education and research and furthering things. It's a completely, there's lots of problems with it, but it's thought through, right? They're playing chess, right? And I think, unfortunately, if the US is playing chess, it's playing it like a gorilla would play chess, right? Just throwing the pieces everywhere, changing its mind, just storming out the room. It doesn't have that long-term, measured, thought out, argued through, and then implemented feel to it, does it?
Yeah, I mean, here on Saving the World from Bad Ideas, we're quite pro-democracy. We've had quite a few guests talking about democratic backsliding and the rise of authoritarianism and obviously all of the problems there. And China is a pretty authoritarian country. It's even exporting authoritarian tech as well around the world, as well as nice things like solar and batteries. What kind of impression did you get of that? I mean, it's one thing. We kind of lionize it because they can take this very long-termist view. That's because they've got like a single dictator at the top whose ideas, can just then be implemented throughout the rest of the Communist Party structure for the next decade or something. I mean, I'm sure you're not suggesting that's a superior way to organize affairs, but like, having just been there, I haven't been to China for almost a decade. Like, how does that feel?
Well, I mean, it comes, you see it, if you want to get access to everything you're used to being able to get access, you need a VPN, right? There are things that you cannot
You mean
access.
on the internet, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So the information environment is controlled, and it is very paternalistic in that sense. And you'd think there'd be a lot of frustration. Maybe you talk to young people, was able to chat to some of the students there. Do they feel hemmed in? Do they feel, like angry that they can't get access to? And actually, quite often what you'll hear, and of course this is parroting what they want you to say, is, well, I don't want full freedom because it might, I don't need to see everything. Some things are harmful. Or I don't want to be, I quite like the fact that I'm not being made to feel miserable, or that, because they pick up, of course they get they have a window onto the West. They can see what's happening here too, and our version of freedom can look pretty dystopian at times. So it's a really big philosophical discussion, isn't it? Because absolute freedom doesn't work, right? It just doesn't. As Naomi Oreskes famously said, freedom for the wolf is slaughter for the lamb, right? So whose freedom are you protecting? In the US, we protect corporate freedoms more than anything else, right? Corporate ability to do what corporates want is lionized. And that means that they survey the country's habits. They're watching what you're doing. They're marketing to you. They're, lots of stuff in the pursuit of shareholder value. China's doing all of those things and more in the pursuit of stability. That's what they would argue, that we create a society that is stable. You can't really say that there aren't downsides to both, right? And what would be fun is if Europe could be a really good mixture of the two. But I don't know that we've got the cohesion or harmony in Europe to do that. But yeah, neither is perfect by any stretch. And I don't know enough about the data. You can get a feel while you're there. It feels very dynamic. It feels well run. But, I've been in the big cities. Actually, I did get out into the countryside, the Great Wall, and drove through the kind of more rural areas. But it's an impression, right? And so I don't really know. I'd love to dig into the data, but how would you find it? That's the question, right?
Yeah, and of course, I'm asking you to sum up a country of 1.8 billion people in just 20 seconds, if that's all right, and just give us your general impression.
It's a bit of a hard call.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you get the sense that this is a project of climate change, their sort of big clean energy build out, or is it to do with air pollution, or is it to do with just dominating the economy going forward globally with exports and so on? Like what's the big? Why are they doing it?
It's just energy security. It's recognizing energy as an input to the entire economy, and that energy is a function of growth and development. And if you don't have it, or it's too expensive, or it's then you can't do what you want to do. I mean, they more than anyone have had to work out, like, when they do, we're going to do EVs at scale now. Do do it here. They have to, the access to energy is a massive part of that equation. So yeah, it's about that. It's about being able to maintain prosperity, maintain independence, maintain affordability. Climate is in there. I mean, they're very pro-science, right? So they're not skeptics in any way on climate. And so, yeah, that definitely features. Air quality was a big driver, right, for the cities, but they cracked that one by just moving the power stations further away and putting in HVDC cabling, which is actually also an amazing innovation that they did better than anyone else. So it's a combination of those factors. But the big one is not having any oil and gas. If you don't have access to your own oil and gas, they don't like to be relying on other people. And so self-sufficiency is the driver.
And then maybe accidentally then they've made solar so unbelievably cheap apparently there's a lot of overcapacity in China that they're just dumping it on Pakistan famously and other countries in the global south which are now building out solar at it's a huge rate actually, and they're kind of from the bottom up. This isn't like grid stuff being done by utility grids. This is householders literally just plugging in, right? Which is an incredible shift, and is driven by, I don't know, accidental export imperatives from China, it seems.
Yeah, well, I mean, the story is, well told. Starts, I think, in the US with NASA, right? And then Germany goes, right, we're going to do solar, and famously starts to manufacture it at scale, brings the cost down, and then China goes, oh, that's good. We've got a lot of sunshine. We'll do that too. And then we can manufacture. Great, let's do it. And here we are now with this massive. I mean, there's going to be quite a lot of oversupply in that market for sure. And there is. And people are predicting a slowdown. They're predicting a kind of falling away of demand from within the Chinese market. So what do? They move out into export, and they're also got great relationships with lots of different countries. So, I mean, great relations, that's a euphemism for kind of, there's quite a lot of interdependency. And even Nepal's a great example where suddenly everyone in Nepal's driving electric vehicles. Why is that? Because China just went, here you go, you're going to buy these now. And that is what they'll do. They'll fan out, and they already are. Southeast Asia, the uptake of solar and EVs is rapidly rising, right? And batteries combined. So it's the whole deal. And if you think about it, if someone turns up and says to you, hey, this is going to be a bit of upfront capital costs here, but hey, we can probably lend you the money. Once you've installed it, that's it. You just run it, right? You've got your solar and your batteries. That is going to run your infrastructure. Someone else turns up and says, oh, I've got this really great fuel. You have to install lots of infrastructure to absorb it and to burn it. And then once you've done that, you have to keep buying it from me continually, forever. Because as soon as you've burnt it, it's gone. That's such an unattractive proposition compared to the electrotech proposition. And of course it's winning.
Well, and in places like Africa, most obviously, I mean, particularly where there's no access to electricity at all, a few solar panels and a battery, and suddenly you've got a small grid, and they can get connected, and it's probably the quickest way to get people to connected to electricity, at least at the outset, right? And the fact that China's got all these exports at such low costs is going to be a complete game changer for Africa, I think. But to go back to our favorite topic, is there a role for nuclear in Africa and in the poorer countries as they sort of industrialize and get more electricity for their populations?
It's a good question, isn't it? I mean, I think the place it lives starts and it'll win or fail in is the really big countries who've got big enough markets to justify the regulation, the infrastructure, the fuel supply chains, the manufacturing, all of that. And that's going to be US, China. I mean, we haven't talked about Russia, but Russia's always maintained its nuclear capabilities, its domestic commercial nuclear capabilities, and they've been selling reactors. Rosatom is the one that goes out selling its wares to a lot of people. India famously signed a contract with 10 nuclear reactors prior to the troubles in Ukraine and the illegal invasion in Ukraine. So so those are it's the big blocks that will do it. Now, whether that then means there's an affordable reactor and a regulatory environment that can sustain it in countries that are, earlier in their development curve, I don't know. It'll be an interesting thing to watch. I mean, certainly the Middle East is embracing nuclear, and that's adjacent. Perhaps you don't need it if you've got transmission and you've got lots of distributed renewables. I think maybe I'm definitely not a nuclear everywhere person. I really don't want to be characterized as that. I strategically think it has a role to play, and I'm particularly interested in China. If Africa goes down that path, it'll only do so if it's cheap. And that's the test, right? In 15 years' time, will you be able to dial up and get a cheap nuclear reactor? I don't know. 30 years' time, maybe.
Then it'll be too cheap to meter, eh?
I don't know about that. I mean, interestingly, solar's getting too cheap to meter in the sense that it's now negatively pricing. And there's a point at which saturation gets reached unless you're, then you're waiting for all these transmission lines to go in.
Or if you have enough batteries, then you don't need transmission either, because you only need to transmit then, not when you're generating, but when there's the demand, and you can do arbitrage and sell at high prices and load up your batteries at lower prices. And I could even do that at the household level. I've got a solar array here, and even in the UK, if I had, if the batteries came down in cost sufficiently for me to charge them up at night and then, dump it back into the grid during the day, and particularly if the whole thing's run by AI or something, you wouldn't want to do this by hand. And enough people are doing it. That's going to change the whole dynamics of how utilities and grids and everything operate. And I don't think, I sure as hell don't have a sense of how that's going to play out. I don't know. Do you feel you do?
No, not at all. And that's the interesting bit, right? That there's all this dynamic end of wire change happening where people are just going, oh, hang on a sec, I've got sun and I've got a garage, I've got a battery, and then I've got my EV, and like kind of detaching themselves from the old utility model. And for a period, that was a problem, because all that was happening was you're seeing demand destruction on the grid. Like, it just was showing up as negative demand. They were just disappearing. And then suddenly the cost base, you're having to spread the same fixed costs over smaller and smaller numbers of customers. So then prices start to rise, and everyone it's sort of been happening, I think, in an unplanned way, certainly. And now we've got people hanging solar panels off balconies in Germany, wherever, like Australia, suddenly rapidly everyone's got a solar panel on every roof. And that really challenges the existing utility model. But what's changed there, and I think this is part of why I think that nuclear comes back, is that demand is starting to rise again. So whereas demand was just being destroyed or holding steady, we're seeing demand rise because of the increase in use of IT and data centers and AI. And that is causing people to think again about bigger projects, more investment into conventional generation, which was kind of frozen for the longest time. And of course, famously, you can get hold of solar panels and batteries faster than you can a gas turbine at the moment. There's a big waiting list for gas turbines. So it looks like that's going to be a boost for renewables in the short term. But it also means that when you pitch your modular reactor to a utility, then you've got a stronger case for it, because the demand growth is back.
I did want to talk about AI and data centers. Nuclear is beginning to sound a bit like a niche product, though. It's like 15 to 30 years away. It's good for these, heat things, powering cities with
these heat steam things. That is about a third of primary energy. So, you can't just dismiss it.
Is CHP a third of primary energy?
No, heat is a big part. I don't know exact data. I can check for you, but you can't dismiss it, because it's driving industry and manufacturing as well as heating buildings, right? So it's a big portion.
All right. But is one of these niche applications AI and data centers? Because I know there's been some deals signed, haven't there, with some of the big companies and some of the newer SMR companies. Are these just like paper MOUs, or is some of it actually commercially relevant?
Yeah, Google's been doing quite a lot of this, right? Trying to pull forward the supply curve with underwriting it with PPA, the power purchase agreements, and I think that's a good thing, right? It's a way of getting over in the West this problem you have between, I've got my demo, but I can't get it out of the valley of death into commerciality, and so my first of a kind's got to go to N of a kind. And how do I do that? And so Google and others, big buyers, have been trying to solve for that. And their contract with Kairos is the one that perhaps most relevant to the nuclear debate. And they did their homework. It's got a very, very talented team. It's, as I say, they've already broken ground on their test reactor. But also, Google will be around the world trying to build things now, right? Not waiting for the 5 to 10 years it takes Kairos to get their reactors on the ground. And they're probably doing geothermal. And they may well, then they'll be certainly doing batteries. They'll certainly be trying to do wind and solar where it makes sense. And they'll probably be building gas as well, right? And that is the thing that is going to happen in the near term, is we'll probably see a lot more gas burnt, as well as everything else.
Well, you mentioned geothermal a couple of times, and that's another heat thing, as I like to put it. Is that going to be something which is very geographically restricted in tectonically hot zones, or is it becoming something which can be deployed more or less anywhere now?
In theory, you can deploy it anywhere, within. The thing is that we can drill deeper and we can fracture the rocks and create heat stores in ways that we couldn't previously, thanks to the, unconventional shale gas developments. And so those drilling technologies are now coming across to geothermal, and it is changing the game. So you can drill where you need to rather than where happens to be a geological feature of like wet rock heat. You can go to dry rock and you can start to drill. And I think probably we did an episode with Jamie Beard, who works for the sort of geothermal house promotion of geothermal, and talking to her, she's got a really, really compelling story about how oil and gas service companies, so the Halliburtons and all the guys who, because the big named oil companies don't do their own actual infrastructure, they'll contract in, and those contractors are now realizing they've got another potential buyer of their services, and that's the geothermal. So that switch is happening. And I think, although you could do it anywhere, I suspect where it will come first is places like America, where you've got a lot of land, not many people, and a fairly light touch environmental regulatory environment, plus all of these people who've got these specific bits of kit and specific skills you can switch across. So I think geothermal could be quite significant. But yeah, it'll be this interesting confluence of an existing workforce and an existing set of infrastructure that can be pivoted. Yeah, which isn't everywhere.
What about nuclear fusion? I mean, I've been a skeptic on this, but I keep reading headlines about new breakthroughs, and I don't follow it closely enough really to be that informed. I mean, is it a serious challenger to fission in maybe 30 years?
I don't know. I mean, occasionally, every conference you go to, you'll meet a fusion person now. I think it's a long way off, and I think there are some fundamentals that make it incredibly, incredibly difficult, right? And they sort of trade themselves as the clean, squeaky clean version of nuclear. But the truth is that, if you're creating these fusion events, it creates radiation. Like there's an element of it which is just very hard to handle and contain. And I think I don't want to say we're not going to do it. Maybe we will. I think it's being oversold somewhat right now. I think the problems are very, very challenging, and let's see. And you've got different versions. I mean, you've got the sort of slightly small. Some people are saying, we can get it down to a very small scale, and there's the tokamak, massively huge experiments going on. I'm all in favour of keeping the experiments going, and I wouldn't want us to stop trying, but don't see it riding over the horizon to save us. The timescales just don't match up, and the challenges are just too fundamental still, I think.
And the thing that bugs me about the argument for fusion is that the reasons they give for doing it are actually, the improvements they say over fission actually are kind of imaginary anyway. I mean, it's like, it doesn't produce waste. Well, I don't care about waste.
No,
anyway.
it does.
It's really a non-issue. And so,
yeah.
Even so, nuclear waste from fission is not the issue that it's.
Oh, exactly. And even so, yes, there's 2 points.
So what problem are you trying to solve? Even,
yeah. No, I mean, we haven't talked about. In fact, which has been refreshing, your skepticism about nuclear, it stems from speed and affordability rate. And that is where the nuclear sort of skepticism is now retreated to. I get less and less people saying, but what about the waste? Or what about the accidents? And, just that, thankfully, I think we've got through. Hopefully people are realizing that those were never really issues, and we can make them feel like bigger issues than they really are. But to what end, really? Yeah.
Yeah. And I wrote a report for We Planet called Water Waste. I did some of the numbers for if you recycle spent fuel, how long can you basically run the entire countries for centuries? Even the UK, US, everywhere that's stored up quite a lot of spent fuel. If you were to recycle it into a new generation of fast reactors, and interestingly, some of the SMR companies are now talking about this, and they're talking about waste recycling as one of the products that they'll offer, which I think actually is really exciting because you've got the spent fuel from first couple of generations of pressurized water reactors hanging around, and either it goes into a big hole in the ground like the one they're digging in Finland, or you recycle it, which to me is a much greener option. I don't know. Have you been following this? I saw a media report about the US, some of the companies looking at recycling waste. Do you think this is a big deal or not?
I mean, to the extent that everyone was kind of woken up to the fact that some of our nuclear supply chain was not immune to the the problems that we experienced in the Ukrainian invasion, right? Russia is a fabricator of fuels. So there was a definite sudden focus on, hang on a minute, how can we diversify our nuclear fuel supply chains? And obviously where you've got stores of plutonium sitting there, that is a source to go look at again. I think I'm right in saying that the worries about the uranium supply chain have lessened. I mean, famously, places like Australia are big sources of uranium, and there are other places that mine it too. So it's not, that imperative of, oh my goodness, what if we get a squeeze on uranium is lessened. But there's still, yes, your point is that you've got this stuff lying around. If you can reuse it, wouldn't that be a good thing? I think the cost of doing it versus just the natural, enrichment of uranium coming out of the ground doesn't stack up right now. But who knows? Going forward, but then maybe we'll do thorium, right? Because once you've got a lot of fissile material, and plutonium is the perfect precursor for breeding thorium to make it fissile. It's fertile when it's in the ground, but it needs to be kick-started. I don't know, as the honest answer. And I'm not enough of a chemist or an engineer to know how hard it is to process these fuels once they've been sitting there for a while. I suspect they're decaying into all kinds of bits of the table of elements. So it is a resource. It's always treated as if it's a waste, but it contains this a huge amounts of potential energy, because the fuels, you're only using 2% of the fuel, right, before you have to take it out and store it. So yeah, still a lot of energy there.
Yeah, and in plutonium in particular, I mean, I know everyone's terrified of plutonium, but actually it's a really great fuel. And actually, the only people who agree with us on this is the Trump administration, which is a
great.
very strange bedfellow situation. Which reminds me, I mean, the way they want to make nuclear cheap is to tear up all of the safety regulations and basically, kind of, I wouldn't say destroy the Nuclear Regulatory Committee, the NRC, but at least defang it in terms of its ability to hold things up. What's your reading of that? I mean, is that a move in the right direction, or are they endangering the safety of the public?
The safety of the public was gold plated to such a degree that, yes, it became impossible to do anything, right? And when you think about our perceptions of risk versus industrial accidents, nuclear got singled out and treated in such an extraordinary way that, yes, in a way, the Green Movement got to a point where it had convinced everybody that they need to regulate this to a point where it's even safer inside a nuclear reactor than it is on public beaches in Turkey, because the background radiation emitted from the planet is higher than the standards that they're required to meet. And then you've got the decommissioning requirements, which require it to go back to greenfield. So, back to as it was before even industrialization happened, when in reality, if you just leave a nuclear reactor alone for a while, take the fuel rods out, make it safe, leave it around for a while, the longer you leave it, the easier it is to clean it up, right? So forcing us into these expensive overreactions to this radiophobia, really, because people don't really understand radiation. And it's a complex subject, and energy ministers don't spend enough time thinking about it, that we allow this kind of huge kind of regulatory burden to be put onto the industry. I'm not saying be unmindful about safety, but we've become so wedded to this. There's this theory, I'm sure you've covered it in other podcasts, about the exposure to radiation. Is it a threshold event, or is it a linear exposure to risk? Like, meaning that, does the risk just stay there forever until it tracks to zero? Or is there a threshold under which it can be deemed to be safe because it's within natural variability boundaries? And we don't regulate on a threshold basis. We regulate right down to zero. And that's what causes a bit of a crazy overreaction to radiation, which is, let's face it, hitting us from all angles. Comes out of the rocks, comes out from your partner who sleeps next to you at night, and it comes from the sun. This radiation is everywhere. We evolved with radiation, and it's just the sort of degree of paranoia is not really warranted.
Listen, we should probably wind up there, but I'm trying to think. Have you convinced me that we still need nuclear, or we don't need nuclear anymore is a bad idea? I think for the moment, but I think we might have to come back to this. And this is, it's a situation that's just changing so rapidly all the time. I keep changing my mind, but I think keeping an open mind is probably the right way forward. Would you really agree on that?
Oh no, totally. And I mean, I'm a bit like you in that I like to change my mind with evidence. And if it's shown to me there's absolutely no role for it, and China's going to get off its 1,000 gigawatts of coal to provide 60% of which is providing heat, that without it, then I'll be the first to celebrate. But they're building it, they're experimenting with it. It will speed up their transition. I suppose I'd like to sort of convey a sense of excitement about it, because that is what got me through. Yes, thorium was the gateway drug, but then once I really understood just the inherent efficiency of this process, the kind of the land sparing nature of it, right? That these are very, very dense sites which produce a huge amount of power, and that gives us more space in the world to do other things with the land that you would otherwise be carpeting with energy or digging fossils out of the ground perennially. I think it's got a very, very low environmental impact, and that's exciting. And it allows us to do things that, like space exploration, that we just can't do with anything else. So that's why I come back to it as just it's part of our story of human development, has been a part, is still a part, and will be a part. And I think it gives us kind of a hope. It gives me hope. And I'm a very pro humanity environmentalist. So that's why it's in my basket of things I really get excited about.
Well, amen to that. And actually, I agree with you that nuclear is the most environmentally friendly of all of the energy sources, but whether it's the cheapest is remains to be seen. This is our season finale, I think. So I think we should, from producer Rob, who's wearing his Santa Claus beard, without you should dress up in red, at least, producer Rob. But anyway, I think from all of us, it's Happy Christmas. So. From producer Rob, from me, from Baroness Worthington, Happy Christmas, yeah?
Yeah, Happy Christmas. Looking forward to 2026. And let's revisit it again in a few years' time, and we'll see how far we've got. But yeah, thank you so much for inviting me on, and thanks for producing the podcast, Rob. Good
Definitely.
to see you.
Thanks, Bryony, and we'll see everyone in 2026. Goodbye. Thanks so much for listening to Saving the World from Bad Ideas, a We Planet podcast. We Planet's a movement of citizens and scientists dedicated to defending the science and solutions we need to save the world. Please do subscribe and share a nice review, it helps us spread the message. We'd also love to hear your feedback and suggestions at our email, podcast@weplanet.org. Please also join our podcast mailing list and we'll let you know when a new episode drops. Just go to savingtheworldfrombadideas.org or weplanet.org/podcast right now. See you next time.